Have you guys ever heard the phrase style over substance? Of course you have, but what game comes to your mind when that phrase is spoken aloud? Everyone has something different, but for me, it's the Callisto Protocol. It's a game that has some of the highest production value I've ever seen in terms of graphics, level design, and even the atmosphere, yet manages to have the polar opposite when it comes to just about everything else. I've been wanting to make a video about this game for a while now, and I was planning on doing it without doing another playthrough, but I ended up realizing that my memory of the game had started getting hazy and that a fresh go around would be the best approach. So that's exactly what I ended up doing. Now, just a bit of backstory. I purchased the Callisto Protocol on its release despite knowing very little about it, and that's a mistake that I make far too often. I looked at some screenshots and saw how Dead Space inspired, so to speak it was, and decided to pull the trigger. It's been some time since the game's release, and since then a number of things have happened, such as the studio director Glenn Schofield parting ways with Striking Distance Studio, and that same dev studio experiencing some layoffs, which is always unfortunate to hear. Now I just want this video to be clear and set forward some expectations. I'm not going to go into what the development process of the Callisto Protocol was like. I'm also not going to talk about how it's basically Dead Space or about all the consequences of the game's commercial failure. I think those are all well documented and there are plenty of videos on YouTube that cover those very topics. Instead, I decided to make this video focused on the game itself, including all the various aspects of it such as combat, enemy design, and so on, while also doing a deep dive on those aspects. So this video is going to be everything I have to say about the Callisto Protocol. So if you're watching this video, then obviously there's a very good chance that you already know what the Callisto Protocol is. But to those who are learning about this game for the first time, or have only ever heard of it in passing and never played it, well, the Callisto Protocol is basically a survival horror game in space that is heavily, and by heavily I mean basically a carbon copy of Dead Space. In the game, you find yourself stuck in a prison that has been taken over by a bunch of infected people and spend about 10 hours or so working on your escape, while also uncovering some unsettling details that have been taking place on and around Callisto. I opened this video by bringing up the phrase style over substance, and I really think there's no better way to describe the Callisto Protocol. It's a game that puts its best foot forward in its presentation, whether that be graphics, the environmental design, the atmosphere, or even the sound design. These are things that the game does well and at times exceedingly well. In fact, I first want to start by talking about the atmosphere. See, from the very start, the game sets forward this sense of dread and this claustrophobic tension that constantly lingers over every moment that you spend within the game. The narrow, dimly lit corridors of Black Iron Prison feel very unsettling, as each moment of peace is abruptly ended by a sudden and frantic encounter. See, the use of environmental storytelling is a key component in the overall atmosphere. Each corridor you go down tells its own story of struggle and chaos and something that ensued before you even got there. I genuinely found the atmosphere in this game to be some of the best I've experienced in any game. See, the way the lighting is used is fantastic in these deep and dark corridors or staircases leading down to some lower level where you just know something is waiting for you. These moments help build tension, as you never know when something will just pop out and attack you. There were plenty of times where I think to myself, man, do I really want to go down there right now? And that sense of reluctance is one that I had for most of my playthrough. See, I love the idea of being in this prison, and the various areas that you find yourself in are all well crafted for the most part. Outside of the atmosphere, the sound design is top notch as well. Apart from the voice acting, the actual sound effects and the way that the screams echo in the distance are just top notch. You can hear scattering through pipes, things falling or breaking as you make your way down a corridor, and that all helps set up that tension that I was just talking about earlier. The game really never allows you to let your guard down. Now, the camera position lends itself to the goal of keeping you as close to the action as possible. It does go with that God of War style camera where you're closely attached to the character's shoulder. Now, this does end up causing all sorts of issues in combat, which I'll get to later, but I totally understand why the developers went this route. Now, of course, graphically, the game speaks for itself. I was originally planning on dedicating a whole section to the graphics and the minute details, but I'll just make this short. The Callisto protocol obviously uses tech that brings the characters to life in ways that we rarely see in gaming. The facial expressions, the lip syncing, the emotion, it's all top tier. And the environment design takes full advantage of the graphical fidelity, creating areas that genuinely look really, really good. It would be dishonest of me to say that Striking Distance Studios didn't deliver a graphical powerhouse of a video game. The thing about the Callisto protocol is that the positives, for me at least, they end very quickly. The style is there, but the substance is severely lacking. So let's get into the substance. I'll start with gameplay. Gameplay in the Callisto protocol follows your typical survival horror format. You go around area to area fighting off enemies, whether through melee or gunplay. You scavenge for resources to help you gear up for your next fight. And you go around slowly piecing together the story through bits and pieces of information. That sounds great, but I'd be lying if I said the gameplay wasn't the game's biggest downfall. Let's start with melee. Melee in the Callisto protocol is the most insane combat system I've ever experienced, and definitely not in a good way. See, before writing my review, I decided to read and watch some other people's opinion on the game, whether that be critics or just YouTube videos similar to this one. And for the most part, I agreed with the sentiment surrounding combat, but I was shocked to see that some people considered the combat experience to be engaging. See, engaging to me at least means that the combat is fun and something to look forward to. I would describe the melee combat in the Callisto protocol to be tedious and rudimentary. I'm honestly just curious as to what the developers were thinking when they designed this melee system. I know I sound like I'm being dramatic, but the only redeeming quality of melee is the kill animations, of which there are only a few anyway. Alright, but what makes the combat so bad? Well, let me explain. The game has the most simplistic mechanics I've ever encountered. When an enemy attacks, you hold your left stick to the left or to the right. Then you alternate it between enemy attacks. Sometimes the enemy only attacks once before you can retaliate. Sometimes they'll attack twice. Other times, depending on whether the enemy is a boss or not, they can attack up to 5 times in a row as you shift between dodging left or right. That's basically it. That's the whole combat flow. And it's so tedious to get through these encounters. There were many times I would get impatient with the dodging mechanics and I would find myself taking damage as I didn't wait my turn long enough. Every encounter is just so choreographed. You wait for the enemy to complete their attacks, then you retaliate with your own 2 or 3 hit combo, and rinse and repeat until you get a kill animation. Now the enemy will randomly switch up how many times they'll attack in a row, leading to some standoffs as both you and the enemy are just waiting for each other to start attacking. The problem with the melee system is that it legitimately does not evolve past that. Sure, you can unlock a heavier attack or some new part to the combo, but it doesn't really change anything at all. Now, since the game's release, the melee has actually been patched, or I should say the enemy's behavior has been patched. Previously, players complained that enemies would attack at the same time, making the dodge mechanic clunky and hard to pull off. Since then, they've seemingly made it so that enemies wait for one another. I don't think this change is good or bad, to be honest, but I do remember that my first playthrough was more difficult than my second time around, but honestly, it's not that big of a deal. Now, before I get into gunplay, it's worth mentioning that there is a stealth component to the game, and it's your pretty standard affair. You crouch and try to avoid direct line of sight with enemies, and if you approach an enemy from the back, you can go in for a quick kill. This applies for most enemies except the robot guys who one-tap you no matter where you are if you're seen. And I'll get into those guys later on in the enemy variety section. I do feel that the gunplay fares better than melee by a good mile. Each gun feels chunky and the shots feel impactful, but the assortment of guns is honestly pretty stale overall. You get a shotgun, an assault rifle, believe it or not, a hand cannon, and a tactical pistol. Thankfully, each gun feels different to use, and some are definitely far better than others when it comes to actual combat. For example, I found the assault rifle utterly useless. It's a 3-round burst that hardly does any damage, and the use cases for it are nearly non-existent. There's genuinely no reason to use the assault rifle in the game, and it is an optional pickup that you don't even have to craft, and I totally see why. Even when you have it upgraded to its max level, enemies still take forever to take down. As expected, the shotgun ends up being the most powerful tool as it destroys enemies within a few hits. The two pistols are also serviceable, but the distinction between those two is fairly small. My main gun did end up being the shotgun, as it was the most OP of the bunch. Of course, we also have the GRP glove, which is a piece of equipment that allows you to pick up and throw around just about everything, including enemies. It's very useful, but only in niche areas. For example, if you're in an area where you can throw an enemy off a ledge, or if you can use environmental pieces to kill an enemy, like wall spikes or grinders. These essentially allow for instant kills, which is quite nice when things start to get overwhelming. I think overall the glove serves a good purpose because it does help spice the gameplay up and removes that need to rely solely on gunplay and the very lackluster melee. But the problem in general is that the game does absolutely nothing unique. We've seen all this before. Like, it really is a carbon copy of Dead Space, and I told myself, I even stated earlier that I wouldn't harp on the comparison, but when you are basically copying someone's homework, you should at least try to make it a little bit different so you don't get caught. Anyway, I'll quickly touch on the progression system here. I found the progression system to be okay. Essentially, it just boils down to incremental upgrades for your different weapons, and these can help in increasing the damage output, the amount of ammo you can carry, or the stability of the gun. The upgrade resource, known as Callisto credits, are found pretty much everywhere, and sometimes even enemies will drop them for you. Towards the end of the upgrade tree, you do unlock some alternate fire mode that changes the behavior of a weapon, but that's basically it. Honestly, towards the end of the game, I never felt like I was getting any stronger at all. None of the upgrades I was making felt super impactful during combat, and early on I was focusing on upgrading my melee capabilities despite how much I hated that portion of the game, just getting it out of the way. But I was going down that road so that I can make the melee encounters faster. I didn't want to be in them for longer than I had to be. Eventually, I did upgrade my stun baton quite a lot, but regardless, those same melee encounters never felt any shorter. Sure, it might have taken 1 or 2 less hits to kill an enemy, but the game manages to nerf those upgrades by introducing an enemy mutation later on in the game, and actually I think now would be a good time to talk about the enemy variety. The Callisto Protocol has very few enemy types, and you'll see them all within just a few hours of playing. The basic infected ones look scary at first, their twisted bodies and their jerky movements, it's kind of off-putting, but they become boring once you figure out their simple attack patterns. The game tries to make enemies seem different by maybe changing their size or color, but essentially they all fight the same exact way and don't require any new strategies. Now, there are a few special enemies like the two-headed monster, but even those follow the same dodge left, dodge right combat pattern as everything else in the game. The two-headed monsters end up serving as boss fights. Yes, I said boss fights, as the game manages to recycle key encounters by making you fight the same annoying enemies a few times. These two-headed guys are by far the worst in the game, at least in my opinion. 1 or 2 hits from them usually means the end for you. The worst part, however, is how these fights play out. You end up bobbing and weaving a string of attacks until you get an opening to unload some bullets into them. You do this over and over again until you've done some arbitrary amount of damage that makes one of the two heads rip the other off. This essentially starts the final phase of the fight, which, you might have guessed it, is the same exact as the other part of the fight. This is where the lack of substance continues to show its ugly face. Why not introduce some new mechanics or make the player use some new strategies to take these guys down? Instead, it just ends up being the same monotonous fight that we've experienced over and over again, but with far more health than anyone could have possibly asked for. To add to that, the general lack of enemy variety really kills the moment-to-moment gameplay flow. Instead of walking down a corridor and thinking, oh god, what is that? I instead would have that feeling of, oh god, here we go again. There are some enemy variants, I guess, like the type that can't see you, but they can only hear you. And it's obviously best to go stealth against these guys because the game likes to throw a good amount of them at you, and they'll really bleed you for your resources. Also, there are these robots who, if they spot you and you're not in cover, they'll just kill you in one hit from really any range. Now, speaking of bleeding you for your resources, I mentioned earlier how your upgrades don't feel impactful, and the reason for that is the introduction of enemies who can mutate. Basically, these standard enemies later on in the game start having these tentacles sprouting out of them. If you do not shoot them within a specific time frame, these enemies can mutate and become these damage sponges that make the encounters go on for a lot longer. This, in essence, cancels out all the upgrades you make, because once an enemy mutates, they just become these tanks that take so much more time to kill. Overall, I'm pretty sad about the lack of creativity in the enemy design. The game offers up the opportunity to create all sorts of horrific and unique creations, given that this biophage virus has run rampant and caused all sorts of horrors. They really could have created some more unique encounters given the freedom, but every enemy ends up being some zombie who either attacks with melee or some ranged attack. And I don't even want to mention these guys that sprout from the ground and pull you in towards them. I honestly have no idea why they are in the game other than attempting to jump scare you, because they serve literally no other purpose. It's actually quite an achievement as to how the developers managed to create some of the most annoying enemies I've encountered in any video game. Now, let's get into the level design. Level design is pretty solid when it comes to the actual areas that you'll spend your time wandering in or picking up resources or audio logs and so on. Again, I think the atmosphere is absolutely top notch and the level design really lends itself to that. Despite how good the atmosphere is, going from area to area is quite a slog. You know that corridor loading screen thing that many games have done and continue to do, where you shimmy along a wall as the game loads all the assets on the other side? The Callisto protocol is probably one of the worst offenders of this behavior I've ever seen. I can't count how many times I had to do that same exact thing, but it had to be at least 15 times at minimum throughout my playthrough. Anyway, when it comes to the actual combat arenas, they are pretty basic. Essentially, you'll find yourself in a room with a number of environmental hazards, and the game expects you to let loose with your creativity and eliminate enemies by using what the game gives you. Now, when the game was gearing up for its release and doing all its marketing and promotional runs, that design was a key aspect. They really honed in on the idea of using these wall spikes, grinders, and all sorts of environmental hazards to kill your enemies. I get it, some people really look forward to doing that, but honestly, I think the actual execution was just okay. Like, sure, the wall spikes can be fun to throw an enemy at, but towards the end of the game, it just becomes a way to quickly end a combat encounter. The grinders themselves can be pretty cool. You can throw an enemy through them and the blood will spatter on the walls and bits and pieces are also thrown around. By the time you finish one of those combat areas, the whole surface is covered in blood and bits and pieces, and it is fun to see the results of all the carnage that just ensued. But honestly, I just couldn't get over the feeling that all of it was kind of gimmicky. Now, the mission design itself is unfortunately pretty one note as well. It all boils down to going from point A to point B, pressing some button, opening some door, or putting in a fuse. Thankfully, the areas we go through do help in keeping things fresh, but some areas are pretty uninspired in comparison to others. For example, towards the end of the game, you make your way into what was an old and forgotten colony of miners who stumbled upon an alien creature. This lost colony resorted to living in shacks and fending for survival. This same area is very underused and underdeveloped. Sure, there are a few audio logs that I can reference and listen to. There's so much more environmental storytelling and context that could have been added. I guess overall, I just wanted more lore. The story does end up taking you in and around Black Iron Prison, and sometimes they'll throw a curveball at you, like when you're being flushed down a giant pipe and you need to avoid these hazards, or when you're falling through space. I wish there were more moments like this that break up the flow of gameplay. Now, I know this is a nitpick, but the game always does this thing where you're close to finishing an area or making an escape, only to have an elevator break or a bridge collapse, sending you down multiple floors and essentially asking you to find a new escape route. It happens so frequently that it just becomes predictable, diminishing really any surprise or tension. Now, the narrative in the Callisto protocol genuinely has some intriguing moments, but the problem is it doesn't go past a surface level. Early on, when the mysteries about Black Iron Prison and the biophage outbreak start unraveling, things are really interesting. The initial setup does a decent job of pulling you into that world, hinting at these various conspiracies and hidden motivations that promises deeper layers to the story. And there are layers to the story, but the execution is just so inconsistent. Characters are introduced and sidelined before they even get a chance to become memorable or meaningful, and the voice acting is solid across the board, but unfortunately it doesn't compensate for the paper-thin character development and the lackluster writing. See, many reviewers have pointed out that the game attempts to channel some of those narrative themes from classic sci-fi horror films like Alien or The Thing, but it struggles to land the emotional part. You frequently find yourself piecing together events from audio logs and scattered environmental clues, which sometimes add meaningful context but often feel like missed opportunities for richer storytelling. Towards the latter half of the game, the story does begin to escalate and provides a lot of compelling revelations, but these moments feel rushed and underdeveloped compared to the potential that they had. A great example of this uneven execution is Elias. He's a character who seems pretty much central to your escape plans, but ends up just being a wasted opportunity due to the fact he abruptly exits the story. Similarly, Captain Ferris starts off as a compelling antagonist, yet his story arc ultimately devolves into what is rather a predictable final boss trope, and my god, was that final boss fight special in the worst way possible. Dani Nakamura's backstory involving her sister's disappearance tries to provide some emotional depth, but is never explored thoroughly enough to have a meaningful payoff. There's even this intriguing subplot about the warden's true intentions and experiments on the prisoners, which is presented in fragments, making it difficult to fully engage with or really feel satisfied by those revelations later on in the game. Moments like discovering the hidden labs beneath the prison hint at deeper conspiracies, but these narratives remain disappointingly unexplored. There's always this sense of potential that was never realized. The story itself isn't outright poor, it's not, but it constantly leaves you feeling like it could have been so much more with just a bit more depth and thoughtful execution. There's a clear setup for a sequel because there's so much more to learn and explore. The game even ends itself on a cliffhanger, and while they did end up releasing a final transmission DLC to sort of tie those loose ends together, it's clear that the dev studio had the intention and expectation of expanding the story past the first game. So let me wrap this review up. The Callisto Protocol is ultimately a perfect example of just how stunning visuals and incredible atmosphere can't carry a game when the core gameplay mechanics are fundamentally flawed. The combat system feels like it was designed by someone who was in a rush. The enemy variety is lacking, that you'll be bored of encounters within the first few hours. And sure, the game nails the presentation side of things down, but when the actual act of playing feels like a chore more than it is fun, all those beautiful graphics in the world, they don't save the game. I wanted to love this game just based on the visuals and story, but honestly, I can't recommend spending your time or money on something that ended up prioritizing looking good over actually being good. It's unfortunate that we will never see a Callisto Protocol 2 from the way it looks. They haven't announced it. It doesn't seem like it's in the studio's future, as the game was a failure for Striking Distance Studio. Both my playthroughs of the game were ones that I was looking forward to, but was ultimately disappointed with the final product. So that's going to wrap up this video. Thank you all for watching. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I did launch channel memberships for this channel, so if you're interested in joining, it's only 99 cents. You basically get your name on the end screen, and you'll also get early access to new videos. I really appreciate the support if you do end up deciding to be a channel member. Again, it's not a requirement. It's obviously something that's totally optional if you want to support the channel further. Again, thank you all for watching. I will see you all in the next one.